our panel discussion, which I'm very, very excited for. I hope you guys have been thinking up questions, comments, contributions. But I'm going to start us off with one. Because while we were on the break, I was just thinking about, I guess, the themes that came out while you guys were speaking. And the obvious one is emancipation and what emancipation can look like and the way in which you guys engage with emancipation. So my question is, you talked about emancipation on two fronts between the three of you. Outward as an expression in music and in film, and through action and dismantling structures, but also with Gabriella's talk inward, almost reconstructing our own notions of what it means to be free, or what it means to live good. And occasionally we do see these two spheres meet and intersect, but often they are kept quite separate. So how do we bring them together? And for people in the room that are hoping to go out into the world and do something different and take inspiration from what you've said, how do we bring these two spheres together? And I'm throwing it to all three of you.
I don't mind starting. I think it's a really, really good question. I've been really inspired by Val Hooks' work on love, Black Love, and her one of her first books, Black Looks, and the essay in there on loving blackness as political resistance. And in that, she explores blackness and loving blackness as kind of multi-dimensional practice, internal, external, communal. So I think it's about that kind of holistic approach to emancipation, but grounding it in an ethic of love of oneself, love of one's people, and love of the struggle, so the struggle itself doesn't overwhelm you because you see the good that there is within it. But I'd underline the ethic of love, especially in a context like Britain where loving blacks, just even loving black people, you know, for me being in a relationship with another black person, my wife is from, you know, the best place in the world, Kingston, Jamaica, you know, so I'm, or as my dad calls it, kill son. That's another story. But so for me, that is the ground of it, is that love, which means it is self-work, relational work, communal work, but there is a certain kind of peace and fulfillment within that as well.
I should have gone first because you done stole my reference. But what I want to add on to that in this conception of love that I want to develop is that love must be understood as structural. Because I think two of the challenges we have is the individualization and the psychologistic approach both to love and to racism. And there's a concept that I'm kind of trying to develop, I mean the word it obviously exists, moral courage, which is about uniting systemic journeys and battles with our own interpersonal journeys and not severing the two. So this is the essence of what the Live Good idea is really about. And so if we think, for example, of social justice issues, and I was just having this conversation outside with Lez's students, what is the ethic for us that underpins our struggles? So if you go through all the main Western philosophical traditions, utilitarianism, deontology, even indigenous rights, they don't give us an ethic that allow us as black people in England to fight our struggle. There isn't an ethical underpinning. There's sociological evidence. You can show that things are out of order, things are unfair, but what's your basis for then fighting those claims? So unlike America, for example, England doesn't have a creed of equality. They don't care. Like there is not and I don't mean that in a trite way, I mean philosophically speaking, right? The model of liberalism that operates in England is an entitlement capitalism we were talking about earlier, but it also is perfectly comfortable with the idea of the undeserving poor. It's perfectly comfortable with the idea that some people deserve to be rich and others don't, that you're born into your lot, right? Whereas in America, you have a kind of liberalism that the American creed is that everyone's entitled to this equality, and it's on that basis that African Americans make their claims. So for us, what's our ethical underpin? Because indigenous rights doesn't get you there. We're not indigenous to the UK in that sense, you know. And so for me, the how is firstly recognizing that in a very literal sense, because we can say, oh, it's not fair. On what basis? And what's the basis we want fairness to look like? So if we think of liberal freedom and equality, what does equality mean? If you need to eat more than me, and we both get the same amount of food, is that the equality we're talking about? You know, And what does freedom look like if we don't understand interdependency? Because the model of freedom of liberalism is an unencumbered liberalism, where you're free to go and do whatever with no reference to other people, no reference to your family, your community. Is that the freedom we're looking for? So for me, it's to interrogate these concepts, but recognize that we can't just say words out of our mouth, because they come with a whole philosophical baggage that we might be unfamiliar with or don't trace back far enough. And so I think my starting point is the invitation of Live Good is let's have that conversation. What is it? Mutuality? Is that a step up from equality? When we're talking of freedom and liberation, is that sufficient? Do we need interdependency? What's our notion of difference? You know, is difference necessarily antagonistic? Why? You know, so it's to interrogate, have these conversations so that we can carve out a life for us. And know that love being at the center of that is a systemic love. Because good relationships, think of all the things that stress you out in your relationships. You're tired because you're at work too long. Yeah, those are structural things. You know, you're questioning where your partner was. Well, that's because there's a certain understanding of patriarchy that's made us operate in these roles that expect you to do. You know, you don't want to cook, so you're expecting me to cook, and I've got other things to do. You know, these are structural things, right? That it plays out in our life. You know, so for me, it's to begin to recognise that the two must be together in our conversations.
Thank you.
For me, the only thing I can kind of just endorse what they've said. But there's a couple of things, and one is, and I was having a very interesting conversation with the Yoruba sister over there, and I mentioned one of the people who revolutionised my thinking, and he got me to love myself as an African in the context of what our wonderful sister Prof Graham says. We are composite Africans, those of us in the diaspora. So if we want to love ourselves as composite Africans, then we don't have to be too fixated about what part of the continent you came from. Okay, that's the first thing. And the person who really made me fall in love with myself as an African, and I was doing Black History Studies from 1972 when I was 15, so I was introduced to being an African, but it was in a very myopic, narrow, all white people are the devil, bottom down Babylon. Can't read James Fordwell because he's a homosexual. Robert knows what I'm talking about. That's how they used to be. And I think Junior at the end knows what I'm talking about. And then I met this guy, Prof Herbert Ekwe, and my students have heard this story, but I got expelled from school at 15, expelled from college at 16. My twin brother didn't, so I have to own it. But I've always loved learning. I've always loved reading. I've always had a voracious appetite for literature. But I used to do these courses, and then one day, as I said, I didn't have any qualifications of note. I opened up the local paper and it had a course, and it said, African literature across the diaspora, is there a black aesthetic? And I was like, I don't even know what that means, but I want to go and do this course. And I met this wonderful, to me, one of the greatest humans, definitely the cleverest human being I've ever met. And if you meet people like Paul Gilroy, you wonder why anyone would make a statement like that. But this guy, Prof Herbert Ekwe, I'll just do it very quickly. So I went to his first class, and we were having discussions about language. This is 1984 to 85, I studied with him. And he was asking people where they came from. So I said to him, where'd you come from? And he said, well, you'll probably call it Nigeria, but I'm an Igbo, not a Nigerian. That's what he said. So I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. And then I said to him, oh, so the tribe you come from is Igbo? And he went, well, if you say so. And I went, well, what else is it? And he said to me, he left me with this question, and he said, how many people are there in Wales? So we're talking 1984. I had a rough idea, maybe 600,000-700,000. Yeah. And he said to me, how many people are there in Nigeria? I didn't have a clue. I'm not even lying. So I took a wild guess, thought I was being extravagant. I went, 50 million. And he laughed, because there was about 110 million there. So anyway, he said to me, I want you to go away and I want you to think about this. Next week, I want you to come back and tell me why Nigerians are tribes, but the Welsh are a nation. And I have not used the word tribe to describe us as Africans since then. Because what he made me realize is, if we're going to say we profess this self-love as composite Africans, why are we going to reduce ourselves into these non-human? So anthropology, you know what a tribe represents, and they are our people, that's our tribe, we own them. You know, before the reflexive terms in anthropology, like with Renato Rosaldo's book, Culture and Truth, anthropologists owned their tribes, they owned their people. And he made me liberate myself from that. So what I would add is something that I've been using since I met him, because he made me start even writing lyrics in a completely different way when I met him. And it is document, discuss, disseminate. To me, we want to talk about how we're going to spread love as members of the human family. We see something, we document it, but we don't, as we say in Jamaica, wife it up and keep it to yourself. Yeah. You discuss it, and then you disseminate it. It can be through lyrics, it can be through film, as what you've seen, it can be through written cultural artifacts. But that, for me, is what we should do. If we're talking about how to express self-love, that's what we do. And it takes a sense of bravery or moral courage that, you know, Gabriella was talking about. But to me, sometimes we need to get to a point where we just have to have open and honest conversations about the skin we're in.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to the floor now. Does anyone have anything they want to add, ask, say? Yeah, go for it.
Oh, great stuff. Let's have lunch then.
I can keep going, but
Professor Beckford, can I just ask you to sort of elaborate on what incarnation is?
It's just the word becoming flesh. The idea that the Son of God takes on human form. But within African American theology, that has social implications, because if God dwelt in all flesh, then all flesh is good. Bonhoeffer, German theologian who tried to do it in Adolf Hitler, spent some time in America in the 1920s and developed this idea of incarnational theology being a social category, but the African Americans say he learned it from him. So it's in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's work, and that's the idea that I'm using then within the song Incarnation. If God becoming human means all flesh is good, how do we juxtapose that with our experience of racial terror? And how do we then resolve it? At the end of the song, we try and resolve it, and we use a particular song, and that song within the Black Church, I can feel God all over, feel him in my hand. It's the only time I think, implicitly, there's a statement of the incarnation saying that all black flesh is good. So that's what that song's about.
Can I also ask, this came to mind as you were talking. I've been a Buddhist for many, many, many years, and so I was just wondering about how you navigated your relationship with the church as an institution in terms of, the actual oppression of black peoples and how, and your own personal kind of journey in that and how you come to understand.
Well, it'll take a lot more than 2 seconds. I'd say three things. One, I was born saved, which means I was raised in the church, which is important. Second thing is the church loved me. And that's one of the most important things that they ever gave me, was this sense of affirmation and well-being, because Sunday morning was the only time where we were free as black people. And that's why there was such expressive physicality, kind of oral traditions. Children were encouraged to teach from the age of 4, 5, 6, 7. Fantastic space growing up in Britain in the 1970s, 1980s. Third thing I would say is, since becoming an academic theologian, although everybody in our church is a theologian, so being an academic one, trust me, it doesn't make a difference in the congregation I go to. But I would say the third one is it puts me in critical solidarity, because much of my work then is about critiquing the church. So the music project is about decolonizing gospel music. Previous works have been about, critiquing what I would call the continued impact of colonial Christianity on the theology of the black church. Black church's ideas about God are deeply colonial, haven't been deconstructed since, colonial times, although they've reworked them in other ways, but not decolonized them. So critical solidarity with the third one.
Hi, this is a question kind of for everyone. Kind of all the presentations talked a lot about resisting monolithic ideas of blackness, resisting claiming blackness into this myopic ideal, and kind of piggybacking off Gabby's point about the ethic of living good and progressing towards living good. When we decenter whiteness, when we shift whiteness aside and we concentrate solely on the people we've always considered just black in comparison, and we kind of create a blackness post-blackness, what does that look like? How do we go about that? This is not you have to say, but like, what do you think?
Hold on, I have a plan.
What do you think is ways that we can mobilize towards doing that and kind of decenter just surviving under racism as like the narrative of blackness? I think that makes sense, right?
Yeah. I'd also like to add to that, Les, in your talk you said British blacks and clarified that you meant people in Britain that consider themselves black. And if you could kind of answer what you meant by that in conjunction with answering this question, that would be great.
Well, what I meant by that is because, so the best way for me to frame this is, I always say to people, if I go to where my people come from in Clarendon in Jamaica, and I say I'm going to have a rally, okay? If I say I'm going to have an African rally, 70% of them ain't coming. If I say I'm going to have a black rally, they're going to come because they have an idea of what blackness means within that particular concept. So that's why I made that suggestion, because I know, for instance, I could organize a conference here and it would be, some people use it, I would never do it, African family only. Loads of people from the Caribbean ain't going, because they don't see themselves as African. So if they can kind of politically locate themselves within that framework of being black, whatever that means, I use that. So for instance, there's a lyric I wrote, I'll just do it very quickly, got a minute have I? But I wrote a lyric called Too Black in Brixton, where I played on the words Brixton and Britain, okay? It's based on my first experience of going to America. But at the end, I explain what I meant by Brixton. So I go, B is for black, or should I say blackness? Not just a colour, but a level of consciousness. Now I wrote this lyric in probably between 1985 and 1990, I'll tweak it, but I go, so not just a colour, but a level of consciousness. Take a tip from Mello, MC Mello, if you've never heard of him, was a brilliant rapper from here. Take a tip from Mello, open your mind, progress and leave the negative people behind. R is for redress so desperately needed. I found my angle and then proceeded. The grip to untighten, not to whiten. I may just frighten while I enlighten. I for institutionalized racist procedure, like what? The crap they feed you through the media. The X will use for multiplication. First take the T, our tribulation, multiplied by the A, deliberate alienation, divided by the ionized indignation to the power of the government, misinformation. The answer to this basic equation is the black man's frustration. In Brixton, the N, never, 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 you forget, it's a well-known fact. You could never be too black. That for me is what I did. And interestingly enough, myself and my cousin were rejected by, I won't call the name, but it was one of the biggest black groups in the UK in 1990. And we gave them the album, and they said, we like your other stuff, but that we can't do. Because I wrote that, I always say I had a pre-degree self. Yeah, and those lyrics were inspired by when I met Prof William-Lez Henry. He revolutionized my thinking. So I don't care about whether people say, you know, I go to Jamaica, they call me English is fine. You know, I go to Africa, they call me English is fine. No matter what country I've been to in Africa, they will call me English is fine. But what I do know I have in common with them is this idea of what blackness means. So I don't know, I hope that kind of makes a bit of sense. I hope so. I don't know, did it, Lanaine? Probably not. I'm never satisfied.
I think when we use the term black, and I don't mean as an identity, I mean just the word, that we need to ask ourselves what conceptually are we asking about. So blackness can function as identity, and there are multiple kinds of blackness in that sense. So you can speak about blackness as kinship, You can speak about blackness as phenotype. You can speak about blackness as ethnicity, and on and on and on, right? You can speak about blackness as solidarity. You can have notions of political blackness. And I feel that what happens in this country is that we get caught up in blackness as identity and don't theorize how that our actual concern is racism.
Yeah.
And blackness as identity will continue to evolve. We've gone from niggers to coloureds to black to whatever the next version of this will be, and that's partly a political journey and partly a personal journey.
Yeah.
But when we invoke the term black, it's important for us to be clear about what we're talking about. So there's a discussion that goes on, the Afrophobia discussion, like we're not calling ourselves black, we're calling ourselves African, because blackness is, so it's a kind of Caribbean African divide in a sense that's manifest in conversations today. And what's missed in that conversation to me is the recognition that we've also articulated our own versions of blackness. So that discussion about being anti-black is an assumption that blackness is the white man's version of blackness that we necessarily must reject.
Absolutely.
But it fails to consider that there's blackness, the version we've created for ourselves, that is positive, that's beautiful, that's strong, that's everything we want to be. And we might continue to call it black, but we might figure out another term for that, and that will be part of our journey. But that conversation must be linked to and must not be used as a diversion from the actual issue, which is structural systemic intersocial domination. Because we get in conversations, are you black enough? We want to police who's black enough and who's not, instead of policing the people who are oppressing us. Because one thing about oppression, it reforms itself, it reinvents itself, so you can't actually catch those moves. We'll always be behind the 8 ball if we're trying to work through racism by working through identity. And so it's that shift. And the other thing that I want to say that is a huge issue where I absolutely understand what you mean about blackness as who chooses to identify, but I want to add a caveat to that, is that the notion of race as a process of self-identification is very dangerous, because especially in this country, and I'm working on a book about this, collective notions of racialization have actually disadvantaged black people, where you have people who are claiming blackness to access resources that are specifically set aside for black people.
Absolutely.
In the name of political blackness, which is not what political blackness was intended for as a notion. And so you've got, I mean, there have been many cases, like the Rachel Dolezal American version was the kind of most obvious, but that is happening systemically here all the time. There was and particularly with the mixed race category, there was a white guy saying he felt mixed race because he was bullied, who got funding for specifically set aside for theatre directors. You've got academics who are earning their living in the name of black studies, because of this expansive notion of blackness, but as identity, not blackness as racialization. So when I talk about people racialized as black, it's systemically, do you move through the world being treated as a black person, and whether we want to call it black or some African or some, do you see what I mean? I'm not dismissing what you're saying. It's the racialization process that we need to concern ourselves with. How we choose to identify will be multifaceted and complex and will evolve as we evolve.
But there is a little thing you can add to that, and remember this again came out of us in the context of Britain, where we started to spell black B-L-A-K. And in 2005, I created something called Black Friday. And it was Black Liberation African Knowledge. Robert spoke on that for us. So that's what we said. And why it came out of the UK, and again, Prof Herbert Ekway wrote an article on it, because he said something like, where until recently, some would say courageously or whatever, but Asians stopped claiming to be black politically in the 90s because they didn't have to. So that notion of BLAK black, if you want to understand it, Karen Wheeler, who was Soul to Soul, she had an album called UK Black, and it came out in 1992, and the black was spelled B-L-A-K, and anyone who wasn't within you know, how we articulated it. It was about African Caribbean people exclusively going through the black struggles. So, you know, because to me, it's one of the only identifiers we've ever had in the UK that excludes other so-called, you know, that's what Gabby was saying. The UCU, University College Union, or whatever it is, yeah. I stopped paying my fees because I don't even remember 3 years ago, they said anyone who identifies as black or oppressed can be blah, blah, blah. So you could be discriminated against at work as a white person, say that you identified as black, and they would support it as a racialized case. Look it up, the UCU did it. So I left them for about a year out of protest. I did, because it's ridiculous. So, you know, I don't know. But that's what they were championing, I'm not lying. We're only talking 4 years ago. We're not talking 100 years ago. So as long as you identify that you were oppressed and you say you were oppressed because you believed you were black, the union would support. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. I think we can take possibly 1 to 2 more. So, yeah, sure.
Thank you, Gabriella, for your piece. It moved me. Les
Thank you.
and Robert inspired Gabriella's piece. Having said this concept of love and structure kind of reminds me of this South African concept of Ubuntu, which is I am me, but I am me with you.
Yeah.
I cannot be defined by myself. I was going to say, oh, I'm part of the global majority. I was going to get into that discussion. But I wondered what goodness looks like in the academy.
So do I.
I wondered what goodness as a social, as a practice,
Yes.
not simply as in the head, but what does it look like in the academy, because we're here. And we are all part of that here.
Yes.
So what does that look
Do you want me to answer first?
No, go ahead.
I think firstly it looks like this. I would say that first, it looks like these two, and it looks like you all sitting here, because as you're right, we are in the academy. I think for me, the critical journey for the academy is to expose itself
Absolutely.
and its underbelly of its origins, its intentions, and its current aspirations. And I think there's a conversation about the university have gone neoliberal, and absolutely, and that's a huge problem. But that's often juxtaposed to a kind of fantastical version of the academy that's utopian, that
Absolutely.
we just learn
Yeah.
because we're going to grow and we're going to sit with candles and discuss ideas and it's going to be beautiful. But that's not what the academy was founded on, ever, like ever. The majority of universities in this country began as theological institutions, training up the clergy to participate in the colonial slavery, enslavement,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
This was the intent, it was to educate you. They excluded women up until the 20th century for most, they are fundamentally flawed at their core and their, and later on when you get modernization of university, it is specifically to create a workforce to service the needs of the aspirations of this nation. And so I think for me, the academy has to first, let's just keep it real. Like, let's be honest about that history that we've inherited, and then begin that process of thinking about this transfiguration, because for me it has to be qualitatively different. It can't just be a tweaking of, like I say, this kind of romanticize of education for all, and we're going to rotate and we're going to share ideas, because it's not how people work. Yeah, I mean, for all of us who've been to conferences or read books, we know that moral suasion, rational persuasion doesn't actually persuade. Like, you can reason with somebody and be absolutely logical, absolutely on point, like your video, have all your ducks and facts lined up, and that person will walk away as ignorant, with the same ignorant mess opinions that they had before you had that whole conversation. And so that notion of rationality as deliverance in the sense of transformation itself is problematic, but that's what the academy works with that assumption. So our understanding of how knowledge transforms needs to shift. So for me, what it looks like again is daring to have events like this, daring to ask the questions that we're asking, and really drawing back to, well, what do we know about humans? And not only grounding it in a lived experience, but we've had enough years knowing that I can reason with you and you can reason with me, but if it doesn't move you, if your spirit doesn't take to it, or if you've got you've got a psychological background that makes you blinkered to certain things, I have to do something to remove those blinkers, and convincing you verbally is not going to get it done. Right, and so what are our epistemic frameworks that think of what does the academy test? Very narrow range of human skills. What do our curricula look like, our assessment frameworks? You know, do they allow for an expansive pedagogy? Everyone's trying to decolonize something right now. How are you going to do it? Like if students have to ultimately answer to a bureaucratic regime that confines thought, that stifles creativity, that we have to make a case for culture as being an intellectual artifact. We're here arguing that. Like, why is that not a no-brainer? You know, so for me it's being brave enough to transform the infrastructure and really interrogate that basis, and be willing to say, we need something different. And for everyone to battle for that. Students to know their power in that journey. Students, you pay the bills. And I can say this because I'm an independent, right? You pay the bills so you have more power than you think you do, right? Because since we're going all neoliberal with yourselves, it's that money that counts, right? Yeah. So be in conversation with your professors who are doing the kinds of work that you want to see more of. Form those alliances. We have student movements. Why don't we have student and faculty movements together? It looks like faculty being brave enough to stand with the students when they're fighting for something and not being afraid about them losing their job, and so they stay silent even though they know that they have to sit through those exam boards, you know, and the BS of that, right? When they could be out creating a dynamic module, you know, or something. So it's, those kinds of entry points, regardless of what level we are in the academy, to shake it up, and to take the time, not to be, sorry I'm rambling, but I'm passionate about this shit, you get me going now, but like, you know, to have a long-term vision. Part of the issue is we're too short-term. Did you pass your exam? You know, what's our budget for this year? You know, how are we on the ratings? This, you know, did we get that ref money? You know, I need this to get my job, but what's our bigger vision? And maybe we won't see it, and the spiritual is necessary because probably we won't. But what's the long-term plan? So
thank you so much.
Well, sorry, but a very quick example of that.
I'm gonna have to give you guys for 2 minutes.
In all seriousness, if you look at what's happened with Professor Lez back at Goldsmiths, he sums up exactly what Gabby just said. Just look him up. Why he's walked away from, you know, what he's been doing there for over 40 years because of a matter of integrity. Les has walked away from that. So look at what's happening with Les.
I would just add to be in kind of diunital solidarity with you, but my approach is slightly different. What a goodness looks like for me is two theoretical concepts which have practical implications. One, fugitivity. I think being a black scholar in the academy means that you're always on the run. You're always on the run from crazy people, crazy students, crazy curricula, all kinds of things. And therefore, as a fugitive, you have to, not Les, I'm not talking about it, but in terms of Fred Morton's work on fugitivity, I found that really helpful. We create, because fugitivity, although it's related to Afro-pessimism, isn't pessimistic. It's about how we create these spaces of well-being, of flourishing inside these oppressive systems. So the other theoretical tool I found really helpful is borderland thinking, where we're always on the borderlands. We're fugitives, and the borderland is really creative space, and that sustains us and empowers us. And that for me is where the goodness is, because, and I'll just end with this, in my discipline, the juxtaposition is hell. Theological education in Britain for black people is hell. Why is it hell? Because theology is the most colonized discipline in the humanities. Why is that? How can we say that? We can say it for 3 reasons. One, because there are 700 theologians in Britain, only 2.5 who are people of colour. Has the worst record in terms of recruiting and developing black scholars. We can say 2, because where all the funding goes. Doesn't get the funding for work like at Queen's. They don't get the funding. largest cohort of black students, least amount of funding. Where does the funding go? Where the fewest number of black students at present. So there's a problem there. Second problem is this. Just go through my little party piece about theology, if you don't mind. Second thing is this. In 500 years, how many books have theologians racialized as white written about slavery, colonialism, and the church's collusion with it? In 500 years, 1.5 books. 500 years. Comparative point, I do this as an exercise with students because you send them out to look for the books. Kills 2 hours, you have a coffee, come back. All this nice blended learning stuff. All these new kind of pedagogic practices have their benefits, you know, if you can work them for you. They come back and I ask them then, the second time I say, how many books have theologians racialized as white, just in the last 20 years, written on animals? Being nice to animals because animals have souls. They come back and say, 52. I said to them, now isn't there something that worries you here about 500 years so deeply colonial, doesn't write about, let's just remember what's happening as we speak. Which department is inviting Jordan Peterson, another white racist, to, in the name of free speech? Department of Theology. What gets hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of funding at Oxford University? The Ethics of Empire Project, a research project to show that empire did good.
Absolutely.
Now, so for me, I have to live as a fugitive. I have to live on the borderlands because mainstream theological education in Britain, it's hell.
And on that note,